History channel. Today I'm going to read from The Battle for China, Essays on the Military History of the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945. So I know it's been a while, but continuing from last time, essentially I will continue reading from this book. Last time it was in Mandarin, mostly discussing the Japanese military objectives of the war and the economic objectives. But today, let's begin from the actual text. So it will be more reading, less analyzing. Japan's seizure of Manchuria and its consequences. In the late 1920s, a series of economic crises in Japan led to social and political unrest, which seriously distorted the direction of Japanese foreign policy. In the first half of that decade, the nation's economy had been stimulated by the government's public investment following the Kanto earthquake of 1923. So this is kind of a interesting turn of events, that some earthquake caused more government investment, which actually caused economic growth. By 1927, however, Japanese financial crises, including a series of spectacular bank failures and the impoverishment of rural communities due to the collapse of rice prices, later exacerbated by the onset of the World Depression, dealt a sequence of blows to Japanese domestic markets and to the export trade that in turn led to widespread unemployment in Japan. By the beginning of the 1930s, the Japanese public had lost confidence in the nation's industrial leaders, in the fairness of the international global economy, and in the ability of the established political parties to rescue the nation from economic disaster. To many, at the reins of government, overseas expansion offered the solution to overpopulation, unemployment, economic depression, and security concerns. So notice here that Japan is falling out from the international order and losing trust in the capitalist global environment supported by countries such as the United States, Great Britain, and so on. And it's gradually losing trust. On the continent, Japanese military ambition enjoyed its greatest freedom from interference by the civil and military authorities in Tokyo. The consequent belligerent expansion of Japanese field armies challenged the wave of resurgent Chinese nationalism in the late 1920s. So also notice here that this enabled sources outside of the Japanese government to gain more power in Japan, basically because the central government has failed to provide solution for its people. If you look at it, here spectacular bank failures, especially the collapse of rice prices when such a staple food is difficult to buy. People become wary of the government. On the continent, Japanese military ambition enjoyed its greatest freedom from interference. So basically they start, the authority falls apart, trust in power falls apart. Some terrible things are about to happen in Japan. As Chiang Kai-shek's or Jiang Jie's military expedition to unify China had moved north in 1927, fighting a continuing struggle against communist efforts to derail it, the Japanese field units in northern China and Manchuria had taken alarm at the potential threat to Japanese interests on the mainland. So, destabilized China is not really good for Japanese interests in Manchuria, because when you have a destable political environment, when warlords are fighting against each other, there are refugees, there are political dissidents, there are insurgents who will come to Japanese Manchuria, and that's not good for the stability of Manchuria. In addition, if Chinese nationalist movements become resurgent, the ability of Japan to hold on to Manchuria against China may become questionable. That might be a far-fetched, but in the near term, Chinese warlords which support Japan may be in trouble if Chiang Kai-shek becomes too powerful on the mainland. In spring of 1928, the civil government had dispatched 5,000 troops to protect Japanese nationals in Shandong province, which lay directly in the path of the northward sweeping nationalist forces. So that's interesting. So the civil government, meaning the Japanese civil government in Tokyo, saw it necessary to dispatch 5,000 troops, which is not a small number, to protect Japanese interests. Because, there's a political change. Maybe there's an established agreement between the existing authority in northern China, near the Shandong province, with the Japanese enclave there. But with the change of power, those agreements no longer hold, right? You have new agreements. Before those new agreements or new arrangements with a new political authority can be set up, you have to send in troops to protect your nationals there. This might be their thinking. Potentially, there might be more nefarious reasons, such as using this crisis as an excuse to develop a military chokehold in China. In this volatile environment, any spark could set off a conflagration between the two sides. Indeed, the belligerent actions of the Japanese commander at Qingdao had ignited such an explosion at Jinan in a firefight with nationalist forces outside the city. Japanese units had then occupied Jinan, which they held until 1929 when the settlement had been negotiated. So as you see, like when the Revolutionary Army went up north, the National Revolutionary Army, that is from Chiang Kai-shek's forces, went up north, they had a change of political scenery, which usually causes a little bit of conflict. As you see, like when the existing power in that area fails and a new power takes over, in that interval is a period of turmoil. But then you have a new system, a new settlement, which is negotiated, and then some moments of stability, presumably. Behind such an aggressive initiatives of the Japanese army to block or deflect Chiang's northern expedition was Japan's overriding concern for the preservation of its special strategic and economic position in Manchuria. The three institutions that share power in the region, the army, the foreign office, and the South Manchuria Railway, all parlayed with warlord coalitions in Peking to secure formal recognition of Japanese interests in the region, but they had little success by the late 1920s. So you realize that the existing political power in northern China, which was the warlords, they were having a good time, right? They were having a good time in Japan's eyes because they had recognized, the northern Chinese warlords had recognized all of Japan's claims in that area, especially the South Manchuria Railway. So once that shift occurred, Japan's no longer happy because the new regime in charge, Chiang Kai-shek, he won't be so happy to continue recognizing those interests. Again, I'm not an expert, just to make sure that everyone understands, so I might be off with some of these things, but big picture idea I'm trying to get. This is mostly for myself. For the army, particularly for its field force in Manchuria, the Kuomintang Army, its preservation and expansion of those interests could only be guaranteed by the separation of Manchuria from Chinese control. You see, with this new power, Japan no longer feels safe. It feels that Manchuria has to be separated entirely from China and any political influence in China in order to remain in the Japanese sphere of influence. Well, maybe more than Japanese sphere of influence, under its direct control. In the later half of the 1920s, the army began to work with the Manchurian bandit leader Zhang Zuolin to check the northern expedition's advance towards Manchuria. But to the younger activist staff officers in the Kuomintang Army, Zhang's nationalist ambitions made him unsuitable as an acquiescent Manchurian puppet. So, as you see, Japan's having a hard time finding someone to collaborate with them. The officers came to believe that only violence could remove him as an obstacle to Japanese designs on the region. So, as you see, the upper echelons of the army wanted to work with Zhang Zuolin, but the lower echelons, the officers, had some issues. Instead of trying to get this through the organization, trying to do internal arrangements inside the organization or change inside the organization, they find the best way is actually to assassinate him directly. And this is a pattern you will see later on in the second Sino-Japanese theater, is that Japanese younger officers find the best solution to inflict political and military change is by violence. That is the most power they have. They don't have political or military power, but they have the ability to inflict violence on others and thus cause political and military change. They assassinated Zhang by blowing up his private train in Manchuria in June 1928, hoping to create a chaotic situation that would force the high command in Tokyo to authorize the Kuomintang army to occupy the region. See, exactly, this is exactly what I mean. They cause some chaos, and they get the political result they want. This is exactly how this works. Zhang's murder, however, failed to create a pretext for direct military intervention, and thus the schemes of the plot were temporarily blunted. The conspiracy was the most dramatic attempt to date by Japanese field armies to hijack Japanese foreign policy on the continent. To date, notice, because it's going to get worse. Its failure did not inhibit others whose intrigues drew motivation from growing friction between the two nations or the status of Manchuria, or Chinese boycotts of Japanese goods, especially in the Shanghai area, and the over-recurring minor but violent incidents in China. The Japanese Foreign Ministry vainly attempted to minimize the discord, but rising tide of national sentiment in Japan, propelled by right-wing agitation in the Diet, the press, and the public, subverted efforts for peaceful resolution. So, as you see, the Japanese government is suffering extreme amounts of turmoil because of the economic crisis. Native-grown political movement has begun to subvert the authority of the government and the direction of the government. In Manchuria, the Kuomintang army, beginning in 1929, actively worked to destabilize the situation. These machinations for Japanese takeover in Manchuria were set in motion by the brilliant, visionary, and charismatic chief of the Kuomintang army operations section, Colonel Ishiwara Kanji, who believed that outright occupation of Manchuria was essential to Japan's existence as a wild strategic barrier blocking the southward expansion of Soviet influence. So notice two things about this sentence, right? The first of which is that Ishiwara Kanji is from the Kuomintang army, which in the Japanese army versus navy conflict, the Japanese army wants to expand north and occupy areas around the Soviet Union and eventually attack the Soviet Union. Manchuria is a good base of operations for that. And the Navy wanted to go southeast and occupy Southeast Asia, and the coast ports on Chinese coast was a good landing starting point for that, because they were quite economically important to China, had a lot of industry and goods there, also a good jumping off point to attack Southeast Asia. So as a part of the army, he would advocate for setting a base near the Soviet Union, getting ready there. And the second point I think I want to bring up is outright occupation, right? Is vital to strategic barrier. So like, this is from army perspective important, but also from an economic perspective. Japan, it does not produce enough food for its own survival. Like, I think it was a net importer, like very heavily. Japan does not have many resources on the mainland, so it requires resources from the Asian mainland and Southeast Asia to maintain its existence in periods of economic problems. Because if Japan cannot sell its produced industrial goods to Europe, like it did during the initial devastation in Europe during World War One. So after World War One, the European economy was in shambles because of the industrial capabilities were reduced. But Japan was doing very well because it had been touched by the war and it was an on the rise industrial economy. But the problem is that after the Great Depression, that didn't happen anymore. You stop being able to produce and sell so much goods, which means you have to have a more closed off, self-sufficient economy, which Japan did not have without its colonies. So it needed Manchuria and Korea, and eventually as many places as it could get. So the Japanese high command in Tokyo was not privy to the details of Ishiwara's conspiracy and was certainly aware of his general intent and that of his Kuomintang army staff colleagues. Right. Although opposed to any extreme and violent initiative by the Kuomintang army, Tokyo did little to clarify its policy because it too had drawn up contingency plans to seize Manchuria at some point. Aha! You see, Tokyo was thinking, well, let this right-wing extremist do what he wants and we'll benefit from it. Because, what's the harm, right? Differences between the headquarters in Tokyo and Port Arthur were largely over timing and scope. The Port Arthur is this Japanese occupied port in Shandong province, which is in the northeast portion of China. So that's where the local Guangdong Army is stationed, I think. Concerned that Army headquarters in Tokyo might restrain or postpone the execution of its plans, in September 1931, the Guangdong Army staged an incident involving an explosion on the South Manchuria railway tracks just north of Mukden, and used this Chinese atrocity to justify the seizure of the Mukden barriers and arsenal. Ooh, see, this is kind of a false flag operation. Yeah, when you have political power, you can pull off these kinds of moves. 2 years of meticulous tactical planning enabled the Guangdong Army, outnumbered 20 to 1, to rapidly expand its operations despite belated efforts by Tokyo headquarters to bring them in. Again, the central government versus the local military, and even versus the local military officers, which are also different from local military high command. Justifying its actions on the grounds of operational security and the principle of field initiative, Guangdong Army quickly overran most of Manchuria. Just to clarify, Manchuria is a region in northeast China the size of Germany, so it's not exactly a small area, and the Guangdong Army had just occupied it without any explicit permission from the government, the Tokyo government, so basically they are doing whatever the hell they want at this point. The Manchurian incident, as the army called it, also led to consensus within the Japanese military that insubordination by the Guangdong Army, while not total, had generally succeeded because it had provided the Japanese military with a pre-consular position in Manchuria from which it could not be easily dislodged by any Japanese government. Yeah, who's gonna dislodge tens of thousands of army men from the territory they just occupied? That's not going to easily happen. But military conquest of Manchuria by a relatively modest force did not ensure that Japan could keep or manage it. Facing the heavy administrative demands of holding a vast new territory, the conquerors therefore created the Japanese client state of Manchukuo, nominally ruled by Henry Puyi. As you know, Puyi is the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. It says here, the last of the Manchu emperors. A bizarre attempt to give the whole scheme some legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese. As you know, he's been ousted because the Qing dynasty is the last dynasty of China, and its authority has been demolished, and the last emperor has been chased into the palace, where the Republic negotiated a deal with him to stay in the palace, and receive stipends, but not go outside. So there's no authority outside the Forbidden Palace. But eventually he left. So the Japanese took him and set him up as their political puppet. A bizarre attempt to give yes. So in its general outline, this method of working through pliable local leaders of an ostensibly autonomous state came to characterize Japanese administrative policy in conquered China for the next decade. Yeah. So as you see, they're trying to get some in the beginning, if you see in the beginning here with Zhang Zuolin, they were trying to get some leaders which had some political authority by themselves in China. They were quite established. Zhang Zuolin is no random person they picked off the street. They were quite authoritative in China already, but then that didn't work out, right? Also, their attempts to negotiate with the northern warlords fell apart because Chiang Kai-shek came crashing into them, right? So then they give up on all those things and say, well, screw all those. We are just going to get our own guys, right? We're going to pick people we want. We're not going to negotiate with any local leaders, and we are going to establish authorities through our military and put these people there, right? And that's a complete different thing, right? Okay, I think that would be all for today. Thanks for listening.